for joining, a couple people. And, if you guys experience some technical difficulties, that's because we had technical difficulties. Anyway, I'm going to get started. I'm going to talk about the Story Champs AAC this evening. And this will be recorded for those people who weren't able to join me synchronously. All right, if you don't know me, I'm Trina Spencer. I'm one of the developers of Story Champs. And I just want to recognize my colleague, Doug Peterson, who's always been my partner for years and years on all this kind of, work that we've been doing around narrative intervention and assessment tools. But it's just me representing tonight. And actually, Doug's on vacation in Denmark. So we'll let him be. All right. And then, I do want to give a shout out to Olivia Peterson, who is Doug's wife. She is also in Denmark. And so, but she's the one who makes all of our illustrations and our graphics beautiful. So she's a very important part of the partnership that we have here. Okay, so I am the director of Juniper Gardens Children's Project and a professor at the University of Kansas. And I just want to disclose that although I'm doing this webinar for Language Dynamics Group, I need to disclose that I also receive financial benefits related to the sale of Story Champs. Okay, so here's kind of what I'm going to be doing today. I'm hoping just to give kind of a little bit of background and introduction for about 10 minutes. I'm going to talk about the materials for hopefully about 10 minutes, and then get into the procedures, hopefully about 10 minutes. And then people can ask questions the remainder of the time, and we'll just go with that. Hopefully we get some more information in the future and we can do this again. All right, so here's my introduction. What is Story Champs AAC? Well, it's kind of two things. It's a Story Champs intervention specifically for AAC users. And we say that it is to build language and comprehension skills as well as expand their use of AAC and really to teach a broad array of symbols and words that they might have on their AAC system. But it also could be used as an expansion for emerging speakers. Okay, so if you're already using Story Champs and you have a lot of either young kids or children who are emerging speakers and you're using the level A stories, this expansion pack would give you 36 additional stories to use, and the words are more simplified. So it could be helpful for those children who are just barely able to put 2 or 3 words together. So it's either those kids who are using AAC, and that's what it's primarily designed for, but then it could be an expansion for other Story Champs recipients. Okay, so why did we need this? Actually, this story goes back a long ways. I would like to say that several years ago, a number of speech language pathologists in the Chicago area were using Story Champs, and they had adapted it for use with AAC users. And I went and watched them and I was like, wow, that's amazing. That's so good that what you guys are doing. But I didn't design those stories for those participants or for kids who were using AAC, and it wasn't quite what they needed. I knew I could do that better. And what we've seen, so there's a group of SLPs and Story Champs users who are like, hey, this is a population that this could be adapted for. That's great. But what we actually see in the research is very little support for how to teach this. So the whole time I'm trying to develop something for these clinicians who are using Story Champs with AAC users, I was struggling to find enough research to direct how to do that. I think it's common that AAC users, like children with disabilities, do not use their AAC for a lot more than just requesting or manding if you're a behavior analyst. Like making requests is kind of the typical thing when you're talking about, like, let's say a PEC system, a picture-based exchange system. Almost always the research and the use is for making requests, but very seldom is it used to express other types of communicative functions. And when I was looking for guidance on this, I actually struggled a lot because 60 to 90% of the AAC interventions that are documented in research actually teach requesting. That is a lot. So then all the other communicative functions are being neglected. And recently, in fact, just today, I submitted a systematic review on AAC interventions to teach commenting, labeling, and telling. Now, there have been a few kind of studies or articles that describe using AAC to tell stories, but they weren't necessarily included in the systematic review because of the type of research rigorous, or because the research designs were not as rigorous as they need to be, or something about the inclusion criteria. Even so, only 14 studies actually targeted commenting, labeling, and telling about something, which is, if you're a behavior analyst, then it really falls under this communicative function of tacting. And so as a result, clinicians have very few evidence-based recommendations. And even I had trouble because I didn't know, I knew it was needed. I didn't know how to engineer the program. And so I had to do quite a bit of additional research. Let me just give a quick tutorial on communicative functions because SLPs and behavior analysts actually categorize these things differently. And I just want to hit some of the broad frameworks for this. There's many, many different ones. And so this one by Weatherby categorizes the communicative functions into behavior regulation, social interaction, and joint attention. The communication matrix has like refusing something, obtaining something for social interaction, and then information. That's how they've organized and categorized those communication functions. And then the Buchelman and Light text talks about wants and needs, information transfer, social closeness, and social etiquette. So they're kind of just like rearrangements of some of the same purposes for communicating. Now I'm going to give you the verbal behavior one because it actually is a very helpful one when we're talking about why and how we design an AAC intervention. Okay, so verbal behavior is socially mediated behavior. So in other words, somebody else is responsible for the reinforcers delivered to the individual who's engaging in verbal behavior. And in this context, verbal behavior does not mean vocal behavior. Okay, so sign language and use of AAC are considered verbal because they're socially mediated. And there's different communicative functions. So we have imitation, which is called echoic or duplic. It's repeating what is heard or doing what is seen. What's important about this first one, there's formal similarities. That means what the two individuals say looks and sounds the same. Right? Or if I was to say, candy, and somebody else goes candy, they look the same. They look and sound the same. And then a request is also called a demand from the verbal behavior framework. It's really asking for the reinforcers that you want. Now, tacting is the commenting, labeling, telling about something. This is naming an object, an action, state, or experience because you see or you saw it or you feel or you felt it. What I mean by that is it's not a verbal antecedent. So you're really talking about something that is like experienced when our senses some other way besides hearing. And then the last communicative function here is an interverbal, which is things like answering questions, singing a song, filling in the blanks, greeting someone because they greeted you, or filling in a blank like a song like E-I, and the kid would fill it in with O. All right, those are interverbals. And the difference between the interverbal and the echoic is that the echoic and the duplic, they have formal similarities. They look and they sound similar to the model. But in the interverbal, it would be a question like, how old are you? And the child answers, I'm 4 years old. Those don't have any similarity in what they look or sound like. And so that makes them a different communicative function because the antecedents are different. So the reason why these things are important is because we could have all of the same behavior right here. And we call this a form of behavior. We could say the word or touch the word book in the symbol on an AAC device. Book, 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 book. But in each one of them, the function is different. And that's because it's a certain combination of antecedents and consequences. They have different communicative functions. And the reason why that's so important is because that's actually what leads us to how to teach it. And what I struggled with in the literature is not all of the studies that were talking about these things identified them this way. And so you would teach a request totally different than teaching a comment. And that's not always clear in the research literature. And so that was difficult for me when I'm trying to create these procedures. I needed to understand how storytelling or how we would go about teaching communicative functions outside of just requesting. Okay, so that's kind of like a bit of a background into the why it's important to understand what those things are, and to understand that StoryChamp's AAC really uses a tact consequence or labeling, commenting, telling about something so that we can get a large unit of a response to be able to shape with many multiple symbols. So the primary purpose of StoryChamp's AAC is to expand children's proficiency with their AAC and to improve their generalized use. So it's not to improve requesting, okay? And it's not specifically just to improve answering WH questions or imitation or tacting. However, we use a tact context, right? Talking about and telling about something to teach their AAC repertoire. And then, of course, a secondary purpose would be to expand the symbols or the number of symbols and promote this multi-symbol responding for communicative functions beyond requesting. So we want children to be able to put together a string of words that make a more complex sentence. Okay. All right. So what's different about StoryChamp's AAC than the regular StoryChamps? Well, there are some differences, but let's make sure that we understand the key features of StoryChamps to begin with and to point out that they are exactly the same. So the three key features of StoryChamps are carefully crafted or constructed stories, engaging visual materials, and explicit teaching procedures. Now, the way StoryChamp's AAC is different from StoryChamps is that the stories are crafted and simplified for using AAC symbols. And then the illustrations that are developed that were developed for StoryChamp's AAC, they have a lot more AAC imaged in the illustrations, and the users, the children themselves, are using AAC. It's not always like a high-tech device. Sometimes it's a low-tech device. Sometimes it's sign language. Not every story has that, but a few of them, most of them do. And then this is the part I was getting to, is the teaching procedures had to be specific for AAC, because you can't just take interventions that you use with speakers and transfer it over to interventions that you use with AAC users. Turns out there's actually some differences in how you go about doing that and the way you might prompt and the way you might support someone. And so that's why I had to do quite a lot of reading, and I did that systematic review on AAC interventions to promote communicative functions other than requesting, so that I could learn about these things and put them into StoryChamp's AAC. All right, so now we're on to materials. So there's a storybook with 36 level A stories. I'm going to show you the illustration booklet that has icons built into it, so they're not separate pieces. And then we have 2 master lesson plans, and I'll talk about the digital icons that are optional for you to put on a child's AAC device if you need it. Okay, so here's some caveats. These materials were designed with diverse AAC users in mind, but we know that they will not be perfect for every child who uses AAC. So we have already done kind of some user testing with different kind of like the envelope of the groups that this might be appropriate for. And we find that it's probably too childish for older children, maybe adolescents, and you know, from grades 5 to 12, I would be hesitant to use it, because many of the story kernels or the pieces, the topics are more primary grade and younger children focused. And then there's also a population of AAC users that we haven't tried it out with, at least not me, um, and potentially might need more adaptation, which would be children with complex bodies. So if they're not able to use a pointer to touch their device or whatever it is, maybe they just have like a Big Mac or something like that. I don't really know that this Story Champs AAC would be really appropriate for them. It might be a good context for learning some communicative responses, but not really retelling the stories. But anyway, so I'm just kind of giving you the caveats. I'm not really sure about that. And also because Story Champs AAC is new, we're not 100% sure what the prerequisite skills are. We imagined them before we did some research, but then they didn't really, we hypothesized what the prerequisites were going to be, and it didn't really hold true. So we really don't know because there hasn't been enough research to tell us exactly what the prerequisite skills are. I think it's very individualized, and there's such a range of abilities and potentials among AAC users. You know, some of them are cognitively or intellectually impaired, and some are not. And so that probably has something to play, a role to play. But here's what I can give you. My best guess is I think that if they already have requesting using their AAC pretty firm, that would be great. Because if the child is not able to get their wants and needs met, then I feel like your attention as a clinician should be on those communicative functions. But once they have a handful of things that they can ask for with their device, I think that would be sufficient enough to be able to use StoryChamp's AAC. Now, also because the instructions and the stories are in English, I would expect that they need to have the ability to understand oral English language. Now, those seem very, very minimal, and I think at this point in time, those are safe, right? But it very well could be needing like imitation skills. It could be that they need to be able to like label, but we saw in our research that we had kids that were not able to label more than like one or two preferred items, and they did just fine in our research in the study with the intervention. So I think these are kind of some caveats, and it's just good to know what the boundaries of our knowledge and certainty are, and these are them. Okay, so let's talk about the storybook. So, like Story Champs, our stories for Story Champs AAC are personally relevant about everyday activities. We tried to include activities that children with disabilities would experience, and and be able to relate to. So they do things like they get sick, they eat food, they get stuff on their pants, they watch movies, those kinds of things. Those are the stories that we have here. You should note on the screen that there are actually two stories. There is a regular story that it fits more with the level A formulas. And then there's a simplified story. And the simplified story still has the main gist of the story that is in the regular story. And it has the three target words that story was built around. The target words are different from sparkle words. If you know sparkle words from Story Champs, they're not like the complex, high utility, rare words. They're actually more common words and most likely to be on a child's AAC device. Um, that's how we decided on the words. I do want to say more about the words. I just want you to know that there's a number of publications just in the last couple of years that have really kind of spoken to somewhat of the debate about core words versus fringe words. And that's one of the reasons why it took me a long time, is because I was like in the midst of weeding through all of these different studies, and these things had not come out yet at the time I started it. But since then, these studies or these articles, not all of them were studies, have really given good guidance that really, in fact, we shouldn't be teaching just fringe or just core, but we should teach both, and that children need to have both. And so that's kind of like the major takeaway with that. And then, of course, that there really isn't a lot of guidance on how to teach AAC labeling, commenting, or telling. There are a few studies on some storytelling, and then there are a number of other studies that'll come out in our systematic review that are very useful. but there's not a lot. Okay, so how did we choose the words then? Well, what we did is just get lists of words from different AAC vocabulary sets, things that would be on common in the first, maybe I think it was like first 100 words or something like that. And we didn't include them all, right? I created lists of these words and then I kind of put them together, one noun, one verb, and one adjective, and put them together in around a story. Okay, so that's what's in red on the three right. These are explicitly taught AAC targets. The stories were written around these words so that there would be a variety and high utility being on somebody's device. Now, in addition to that, because they are part of stories, there are also an array of people, an array of settings, and an array of emotions that are available within the stories. Although the stories were written around the noun, verb, and adjective, we still get kind of categories of people, settings, emotions at the same time. So those things are included. This is a new AAC word list that is available. I also want to make mention this very small print down here at the bottom. Even though this is some of the words in the AAC stories, this is not all of them, right? The stories also have pronouns, prepositions, determiners, conjunctions, and helping verbs. So some of these core words might fit into there. And, you know, at any time, if you're working with a child that that maybe doesn't have one of these target words on their device, that's not a problem. You just find something that's substitutable in the same kind of category, right? And so that's easy. And I think I talk more about this in a few minutes. And when I do the procedures, I think I do. So I'll come back to that. All right, so let's do the AAC illustrations. Here's just 4 examples. Notice we've got a variety of racial and ethnic diversity represented in the stories. One of the things that I like is the different ways the AAC are represented. So in story 27, it's around the child's neck. In story 5, he's signing, and I don't know if you can see it, but he has a hearing aid and he's signing. So that's kind of fun, just the idea that we have have created the stories around this particular population so that they can identify themselves in there. And hopefully they're more motivated to talk about these pictures. Also, you can see that the icons are with it in the illustrations rather than having the icons separate. And by the way, I should make mention too, because this has come up a couple times. People have asked if this is something that you program into their AAC device. The answer is no. This is external to a device. It's not a software. It's not anything like that. It is actual physical materials like Story Champs is, but these are the way we've created the materials so that they're easier with one-on-one individual learning their AAC device. So on the back side of every set of illustrations is a set of icons, which is shown in the top panel. And then the very last page of the entire story illustration booklet looks like this one in the lower right-hand corner for personal generations, because we actually have 2 types of lesson plans. One is a retail context and one is a personal story generation context. And this page right here can be used for that. Okay, so these are the 2 Story Champs lessons. So the first one is, let's see, I have them, I've animated these slides so that they're more useful. Okay, so lesson plan 1 uses the context of that basic story structure, level A story in a retail context. The targets are AAC vocabulary, multi-symbol utterances, and generalized use of AAC. Okay, and those same targets are targeted in the master lesson plan number 2 when we're using a personal story generation. So it would be my recommendation that you work on master lesson plan 1 until you can get help the child be pretty familiar with their device, that they can navigate it pretty quickly and not have to sit there and need lots of prompting. But then at some point when they have the retail down, it doesn't need to be 36 lessons. It could be 5, it could be 10, it doesn't matter, but it would matter for that individual. I wouldn't necessarily be able to get the recommendation of how many, but I wouldn't wait too long, because we always want to push kids to generalize and use things in a generative, more personally relevant manner, which is the reason why they're in a lesson plan too, is like once you've taught how to navigate their device and that they've got all this vocabulary in the AAC, then let's use it for something that's super relevant to them, right? That's the idea here. In the Master Lesson Plan 1, you use the AAC storybook and the illustrations, but in the Personal Generation Master Lesson Plan, we recommend you gather photos of the child taken during weekend activities, class field trips, etc. So they're like real photos, and it would be helpful to get some basic information from other people if you weren't the person that did that activity with them. So like parents could supply a photograph of a weekend trip that they took, or what they did over Christmas vacation, things like that. And then you could use sticky notes and a pen or a pencil. Okay. Part of the materials are the story grammar icons, but everything I've showed you right now, they're in the illustration booklet, okay? But if you do want to put the icons on a child's device, you can get them here. The back of the illustrations has a QR code to get those icons. Now, these are not designed for any other purpose, and they are optional. Their only purpose is if you feel like it's helpful for children to be able to use the icons in their device, possibly for categorizing or to explain, hey, I have a problem, that kind of a thing. So some clinicians want to do that and have done that, and some didn't. In our research, like 2/3 of the kids had the icons on their device and the other kid didn't, and it didn't really matter, right? He was still able to learn his device without a problem. So it's optional if you want to do it. Okay, we're going to talk about procedures now. And the 4 main topics under procedures are prompt hierarchies, individualizing target words, stating supports, and then we do not repeat stories, which I'm going to like hit over the head 100 times, because that's the Story Champs way, and it differs quite a bit from other types of procedures and teaching procedures that people might be familiar with. Okay, so let's talk about prompting. On the master lesson plans, there's a section that says prompt hierarchy. It is a least to most hierarchy, okay, but it is highly individualized. So it's very difficult for me to say, here's the hierarchy when I don't know the kids. So what we've done is identified the different possible prompting that is within the literature, and so there's good research to support least to most prompt hierarchies work, right? But I don't recommend that you do all 5 levels. I recommend that you choose 3, I don't know, maybe three that work the very best. Especially because you don't want children to be frustrated. Any more than 3, they might be like, okay, this activity, like I can't attend to this. You know, they lose motivation, and that might be a challenge for them. The other thing too is, as it said right here in the prompt hierarchy, choose the appropriate prompt levels from the ordered list, but do not use prompt levels that are ineffective for that child. For example, do not use light physical touch if a child does not like to be touched. And I also have a warning over here, physical touch in general should be avoided if possible. We just want children to have agencies of their own body, and they can't actually, tell you possibly that they don't like to be touched. And there are other effective ways to provide the support. So physical touch only if necessary. And then sometimes children do not respond to WH questions. That might not be one of their skills yet, so they can't really serve as prompts. So if your kiddo has a hard time with WH questions and using their device to answer the WH questions, don't use that one, right? So now I just trimmed that list to spoken model and aided language model, right? Using the child's AAC and speech, and then gesturing to the symbols. So that combo, spoken, aided language modeling, and gestures, might be the most common, I guess, and likely the most effective. I do want to say that aided language modeling in the context of a prompt hierarchy looks to be more effective than aided language modeling alone. Okay, and that's one of the conclusions that we came to in the systematic review. Okay, I think I got those, but I did see that there was a question. Or let's see. Nope, not a question. Okay. Okay, so there's not an actual manual separate from the Story Champs manual because it is kind of an expansion pack. So most of what's in the Story Champs manual still applies here. However, there is this one page that says instructions for use. And really, it's just about how you individualize for all the kiddos that you would be using this with. Um, Okay, so the AAC stories are designed for preschool and school-age children with complex communication needs, but not every child is going to benefit from this set of stories that contain these specific words in the stories. So here's what's important. It is imperative that the interventionist adapts the words or symbols in the stories to include semantically similar words and symbols that are available in or can be added to the AAC the child uses. So even if the story uses soup, right, but they don't have soup on their device, you can use food instead, which they're more likely to have the word food. Okay. And then it's the same way if they don't have a sister, but the story has a sister in it, then you can use a different female character that they have on their device. Okay. And then using that AAC word list to check the child's device or to add words to it. I believe it's going to be posted on the website so people can check out what words are taught or included in the stories ahead of time. But I'm not sure it's there yet. We'll see. Anyway, more about individualizing. This came up actually with some of our community partners about whether they should use telegraphic speech or not. And ultimately, we are giving the advice that that you should use the correct syntactical and morphological forms because there happens to be some interesting research recently that suggests that parents who use telegraphic speech, right, their children end up having less complex um, um, language themselves, right? And so what they hear is what they imitate. And so even if your children might not be able to produce a grammatically or syntactically correct and using morphological forms using their AAC right now, as long as they're hearing it, right? When you're using a more simplified AAC form, that's okay. All right. So that I like Mark Fay's version here. It says the misuse of telegraphic input in child language intervention. All right. So in other words, he's saying you shouldn't do it, right? We should model the more syntactical and morphologically correct forms. All right. Let's talk about teaching. So this one is the Retail Master Lesson Plan 1. So we begin with modeling the regular story, okay? The more complex version that is like a level A story. The reason for this is that our children that we may work with likely have stronger comprehension skills than they do expressive because complex communication needs is really about the expressive language and that's what they need to be able to compensate for their communication, but it doesn't mean that they don't understand. And as a result, we want to make sure that we're modeling the most complex, the most coherent and meaningful story possible for them. We also, like Story Champs, follow a whole part whole framework. What that means is we give them the whole story at the first, and then we break it up into its parts, right? That again, that is to build meaningful context and to make sure that the learner is understanding the purpose of all these just words and pieces, giving the whole context before you dive into dissecting it into its parts. But all of our Story Champs lessons really have this like whole part, whole, all throughout the teaching procedures. It's one of the reasons why you should stick to the teaching procedures and these steps that we've outlined for you. And then in this, so in this story master lesson plan, we model the regular story, then we name the story grammar parts, right? We don't have to do that every time if they already know them at some point, but if they need to, need support to do that, that's in there in step 2. But then you use aided modeling for the simplified story. So retell it in the simplified story using the AAC and speech to model. And then the last two, 4 and 5, this is where what should take them most of the time. The child is retelling that same story using the illustrations and icons, because remember they're connected on that little page, they're displayed at the same time. You leave the page with the illustrations and icons displayed. The child retells the simplified story using AAC. If they have the capability of retelling the complex story, do that one, okay? I don't want to limit it and make it too easy for people, because there will be some AAC users who are perfectly capable of really the complex story. So I just want to put that caveat in there. And then you're supposed to support the child as they're telling using the least to most prompt hierarchy that was individualized for them. Now, my point here with the asterisks is that in the last step, it's just retelling with the icons. You turn the page over and it's the icons page. Now, we didn't go further and have the visuals faded 100%. And the part of the reason is because AAC retelling takes a lot more time than doing it through speech. And so the duration of the session was too long. So we're like, wait, this is way too long for the kids. They can't sit, they can't concentrate, and it's work, right? It's really work. And also, guess what? They're already matching with their symbols. It is a visual communicative task. And so it's not as critical that we fade the icons, because the icons could be in their devices, or there's likely a whole bunch of symbols or iconic kind of representations anyway. So it was kind of like, yeah, we didn't need to fade them because that's their modality for communication anyway. But just there could be some flexibility there, given that there's such a diversity of AAC users. So if you can't do all of these steps, you might have to provide some breaks in between, or go really fast, or possibly if you're going to skip anything, I would skip number 2. I'd go from regular story to aided modeling to retell to retell. Okay, in the personal generations procedures, you review the story grammar icons and the story parts at the beginning. Just make sure that they know that, and they would know that if they've been doing several of the retell lessons previously. And then the child actually generates a personal story while looking at a photo, right? Remember I mentioned that the materials would be a photo of some sort of event, or a trip or an activity that they might have gone to as a class or with their family. And you point to the photo and just say, tell me about this. And the child generates his or her story, right? Now, if WH questions are helpful, you can use them, right? Keep in mind though, that when children tell about their own experiences, there may not be a problem, right? And so don't pressure them to have a problem when it's their personal story generation. Just be happy that they're telling you something that they did. And then like you can use sticky notes to draw the parts of the story. Like you see our mock up there, it's kind of silly, but you could do that to provide a little extra visual supports. And then step 3 is the aided model of their personal story. So now in this step, you're actually retelling their story using their device, so they can see it being modeled in a cohesive group, right? This is the whole, remember we basically had parts, and then they generate the story, but when they generate the story, it's all in these little pieces. So we got to bring it back together, and that's why we do the aided modeling of a personal story in step number 3. And then it's the child's turn to retell the story, right? they're okay to leave the page with the icons and sticky notes. This is their story. If they need that help, great. If not, it would be great too. In the research that we did recently, um, one of the parents, we were working with kids in their home. And so, but an SLP delivered the interventions with kids in their homes. And one of the parents had reported that the SLP from the school asked the parent about whether or not the classroom went on a field trip to go swimming. And the mom's like, yeah, they did. They went last week. And the SLP was like, oh my gosh, he told me a personal story. In our study, we didn't actually practice this particular lesson plan, but the kids were able to generalize and talk about their own activities and events. So it was very encouraging to see that kind of transfer. Okay, so my last big piece is do not repeat stories in consecutive sessions. If you haven't heard me talk about this before, that's okay. And if you have, it's okay to have a review. If you repeat stories on consecutive sessions, like is common when you do storybook reading, you would read it 3 times, okay? And there's a reason for that, but that approach is actually counterproductive with story champ stories, because story champ stories are intended to be at their expressive language level and much easier to comprehend than maybe a storybook would be. Okay, so you don't need 3 sessions for them to understand what's going on in there. And then also with these stories, what happens is if you repeat them on consecutive sessions, that promotes memorization of content, like these specific words and symbols. Now, you might think that that's what our goal is, but you would be wrong, because it's really about generalized use of symbols and words on their device, and not must use this word, and this word. That's not the goal. Okay, I know it seems that way sometimes, but this idea of memorizing these words and symbols contradicts the sophisticated story champs instructional design. And we don't want children memorizing content from a single context. Because if they did that, then let's say the word soup and sick would only be used in that context that we taught it in. They wouldn't have those words available to them outside in different contexts, because they learned it in such narrow conditions. All right. Okay, so if we teach content, like for example, if I say retell this story and I make them keep doing it on multiple sessions so that they are learning the vocabulary or the symbols, then that's all I'm going to get out of them, is they're going to memorize that content. Okay, but if we teach the patterns of language, and by the way, they still exist even though kids are using AAC. If we teach these patterns of language, what we get is recombinatory power. What that means is that children can then take all of these words and the categories of words that they've used, and kind of use substitutions and recombine them in novel ways that are relevant for when they need them, right? So here's a great example from the recent study that we conducted. There's a story about warm food, right? Now, remember, in this context, each kid just got 1 session of that story, and it is not in a requesting communicative function. It is in labeling or commenting or telling about, which is tax from a verbal behavior perspective. But what happened was the children, we know this because parents were keeping a detailed log about the children's AAC use. One of our kiddos asked his mom, I want warm food, please, right? So we did not teach that construction, a multi-symbol response, and it was manding or requesting. We didn't teach that either. But because we gave him access to these words in a different context and didn't force a memorization of them, he was able to use them when they were relevant to him in that immediate environment. That's recombinatory power. Okay, so how do we teach these patterns, right? We got to get patterns. Well, there's something that's called a multiple exemplar training. So one of the patterns is character, problem, feeling, action, ending. There's also patterns like within phrases. I feel sad, I feel blank, I feel blank, right? So that's a pattern too, like a sentence level pattern. So this one right here that you're showing is a discourse level or a story level pattern. And the way we would teach it is to make sure that they get exposed to enough exemplars of that pattern. And so they realize it's the pattern that takes priority, is most salient than the content itself, right? So here's another reason to use behavioral technology is this article was written and published in 1968, I believe, and it still holds true. Of course, there's been a lot of research and whatnot to confirm all these things, but in this particular study, or it's not a study, in this article, they basically summarize all these ways in which you can promote generative repertoires. Okay. And I just want you to, I'm just going to point out that these are the things that are in the Story Champs procedures that help promote generative repertoires, not memorization of content. And the reason why this is so much more, it's so valuable to have generative repertoires is because then the kids can use it whenever they need to. They can access them, right? And they can be used flexibly. Okay. So natural maintaining contingencies. So I was talking before about the natural antecedents and consequences of the different verbal operants or different communicative functions. That's really important because guess what? The natural antecedent of telling us, sorry, the natural consequence of telling about an experience is attention or approval, right? We have to train sufficient exemplars, which I kind of talked about on the previous slide. And just as an FYI, there are 36 exemplars in Story Champs AAC. And by the way, you can repeat stories, just not in consecutive sessions. So I would go through all 36 and then repeat them. I'll do them more because they're going to get better exposure and more access to that. So it's also very important that you train loosely. And what I mean by that is that we don't have them repeat a story until it's memorized, because then we just trained very tightly. But train loosely means that we don't use a mastery criterion. I know that there are some behavior analysts that get uncomfortable by this, but that's using mastery criterion. You teach till you hit this criterion. That's actually detrimental to the generalization of that repertoire. And so we train loosely so that we get generative repertoires and not memorization of words and symbols. And then we program common stimuli. So intentionally, we use things like the icons so they can mediate generalization, which is actually the next point, is that we have stimuli that would be considered intermediate and possibly strategy use. And so when those are trained in our session and then possibly they would be available on the device, then we're programming in those common stimuli. There are other common stimuli between the training sessions and what they might get with their mom or dad or their SLP in the school or, with teacher. But we do those things intentionally. We try to make the teaching procedures things that they would experience in other parts of their day. And then the last one is train to generalize. And in the Story Champs AAC, that's why you have that second master lesson plan for generating personal stories, is that is intentionally and specifically to train generalization. So retelling is great, but do we really care that they can retell a story? No, we care that they know where the symbols and words are on their device and can be used when they need to generate their own comment, label, story, telling about something, right? That's the goal, is that we're trying to get generalization. So it's not important and it would be counterproductive to teach memorization or teach specific symbols and icons till they're mastered. Okay, I'm just going to end with some data and then we can talk about some questions. Let me just check though. Okay, all right, so data. So we did this study with 3 school-age children with autism, and it's a little complicated, but we had intervention sessions, and we did an assessment probe prior to the intervention session and immediately following, which is why we get warm and cold probes during the treatment phase. In the cold probes are ones that happened before the intervention session. So in other words, they were at least 24 hours from the previous intervention session, and they're novel words, right? All of the words and all of the stories done in our data collection were all novel, unfamiliar. They were not the stories that children trained on, but they were retells. So these are retells and story grammar scores. So each of those pieces, character, problem, feeling, action, and ending. Each of those were on a scale from 0 to 2, which equaled 10 points. So they could get as much as 10 points. And the warm probes were done immediately following an intervention session with a novel or an unfamiliar, untrained story. And so you see a different kind of an effect. One of the reasons why we did that is because there really wasn't any evidence to suggest that kids were going to be able to generalize and maintain 24 to 48 hours later, right? We didn't know what to expect. So cold probes, so warm probes were a generalization because they were untrained stories, right? Untrained words. And the cold probes were generalization plus maintenance of 24 to 48 hours. And so we were very excited to see that there's this much growth. All right. Carson at warm probes was getting like almost all of the story grammar elements. In other words, he was retelling the story using symbols to indicate all of the parts of the story. It's not as strong for the cold probes, but we still get some lift in that. And then over here on the number of different symbols used, we calculated, we counted how many symbols they used because, and not specific words, because oftentimes they would get in the same category. So they might just say, you know, like upset instead of sad or something like that. And those, we would still count those because they were relevant utterances, symbols, number of symbols used in relevant utterances. I also want to point out that the child with the greatest AAC proficiency at start of study was David. Okay. And he happens to be the one that made the least or the slowest growth. Yeah, let's say that. He made good growth, but it was slow, right? And he had more skills that we might consider to be prerequisites. And so this is my caveat here. And this is where we kind of ultimately decided is that maybe we don't really need to put prerequisites in place because the context is so good for exposure to all these different words and symbols for multiple purposes, right? So David had been using his AAC for a couple years to request, but almost exclusively, and he didn't really have this other repertoire, right? And these other kids, very little requesting using their AAC device, but they seem to like catch on to this quicker than David did. Anyway, that just speaks to, we have more research to do, more questions to answer. And I mean, to me, this is just really encouraging results, and we're excited to keep studying this and learning more about best ways we can support AAC interventions. Okay, I'm ready for questions, and that's my email address, and that's Megan Kirby and Christy Jones. They work for Language Dynamics Group, so whoops. I have a typo in Christy's email, languagedynamicsgroup.com. Okay, I'm going to stop the share and see if we have some questions.
And Trina, if you'd like, while we wait for any potential questions to come through the chat, I know there's a few FAQs that we've received on our end. If you'd like to start there.
That's fine, but please, I see we've got some attendees. I would love to hear what questions you guys have. Okay, but go ahead, Christy.
Yeah, their first one, what cubed NLM would you suggest to use for tracking progress on this type of thing?
Yeah, that's good. Well, theoretically, you could use whatever is appropriate for that child's expressive language, but in the study, we used the preschool version because it was the most similar to the intervention stories. So the preschool NLM stories are level A stories. Kindergarten are slightly more complex and longer, but they would be appropriate too. Now, also, the preschool stories have illustrations. None of the other levels of the NLM have illustrations. So if you're going to use illustrations in your retell for data collection and progress monitoring, you're going to have to use the preschool version of the NLM listening. But theoretically, if they have the ability to comprehend, you should be able to give them an NLM at like second grade level. They could hear it, and then what they're going to retell may improve over time because their comprehension was still really strong. And now you're teaching them the expressive responses on their AAC device.
So Trina, we have, it's Megan. So we have a great question from someone who asks or makes a statement, but is an assumption. So I imagine that this would be appropriate for cognitively skilled, I'm assuming students or learners at younger than grade 5, independent of chronological age. I'm gonna guess this is really a question that we get often that's geared towards, is this appropriate for use with older learners? So,
Yeah.
and so to butt in there, I will say we did have some high schoolers who are AAC users go ahead and give us feedback, and a lot of these stories were completely appropriate. Playing with your PlayStation or your video or Xbox. I mean, like there was a lot in there that they said was really great for middle school, high school. And that's feedback directly from AAC users who gave us unsolicited sometimes feedback. But I want you to speak to that because I think that that's rather than age, we need to think about abilities and like what's available out there, which is nothing.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, so age appropriateness of topics is really what's critical. And because we use what we call child relevant themes or personally relevant, we're hoping that the children who are using these stories or hearing these stories can see themselves in something in close. And so many of the stories in the AAC version will be relevant to older children or adolescents, but some of them might not be, right? So there's a couple things you can do. If you identify one that may not be totally relevant or might be too cutesy or babyish, and you've got a teenager, right? You can look to see if the illustrations are appropriate if you swap out some words, right? So maybe it's the text or the story that's not appropriate, or it's the illustrations that are not appropriate. If it's the illustrations, I would just skip it. And then, potentially you could use the NLM listening preschool versions to, if there were some that were relevant. Again, the preschool version, that's definitely created with the preschoolers in mind. I would love to be able to do another set of AAC stories for older students, older learners to be age appropriate. And I do think when I'm developing a story, I do have an age range of children or yeah, in mind. Now, of course, that's different than their language development or their communication development. And so that's if you can still use the teaching procedures, but draw a sample or something that is relevant, maybe watching a video, a YouTube video or something that's more age appropriate or a part of a anime or something like that and have them retell that would be appropriate. Just follow the AAC teaching procedures the best you can. Anyway, that would be my advice. Right now, I can't speak to with any certainty that it's appropriate for older learners. Some of them will be, some might not be, and feel free to adapt or skip. That would be my suggestion.
Well done. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We have another one here. Alex, before we get it, there's an anonymous question that is just way beyond the scope of this webinar. So that might be a whole hour in and of itself, about like, what should people program into a device?
Wait, actually, Megan, can I just answer that one? It's going to be
Yeah,
really short.
okay. If you want to,
Nothing.
go for it. Can you do it succinctly? Because
Yes, nothing. Take the device the way it is, or if you have control over the programming, great, you've got a list of vocabulary, get them in there. You don't need to program anything. You
Got
can
you. So like
adapt the
advanced.
story.
Yeah, so
Right.
people are looking for easy answers. It's like, what should I start off with? And I see where you're going here. And we need to make really child or learner specific
Mhm.
decisions that are
Yes,
unique, that are functional for that learner, and that
exactly.
really go to that individual and not just here's
Yes,
this universal, list of words that aren't important to them. So great.
exactly.
Good answer. Good answer.
I
All
can
right.
only select words that might be appropriate, but the clinician has to finish it all the way to individualize for every learner they have.
Isn't that what makes something an evidence-based practice?
Sure does.
I feel like someone wrote a paper on this, aka Trina. Um, okay, so then let's just take one more because for sake of time, we did it. It's an hour. Good job.
Oh,
Way to persist. Thanks, Christy. So during the ALM simplified story model, don't really know what that one is. Do you have recommendations for how much language to model with AAC? Do you match the child's aided mean length of utterance, or MLU, with AAC +1? Do you understand this question?
yes, I do understand this
Great.
question. Okay, so I think it goes something like this. Let's say the child can put together one symbol to respond to character, says boy, right? Um, and they're wondering what to model for the child. I would model a 2 or 3 symbol utterance, no matter what. That's the way the simplified stories were designed, right? And then you're just happy and you can prompt them to do what they can do, right? You can accept anything, any approximation of that. But in the modeling, I would do at least what's available in the simplified story. Now, your vocal speech is going to be more like the simplified story with all of the determiners and pronouns and things like that. What's aided may simply just be two, like boy play, right? Or boy home. But you would say, the boy was at his home, touching boy home, right? Two symbols, but like 5 words. All right. And so you want them to hear that complex model and then give them a more complex version of the utterance that you expect of them. Okay. That makes sense, Megan.
Yeah, no, I actually understood that. And so great, Alex. Thanks for that feedback saying that you also understood it. Any other, I'm just gonna look through. There's a certificate form if you need one. That's in the chat, everybody. Um, just scroll a little bit up. I think that's it for now. Thank you all for really being psychologically and internet-wise flexible to kind of come with us and find us over here on this Zoom. We will post a recording of this so that you can share it with others to our YouTube page, and we'll get that out there. We'll also post a updated link to our Facebook page for the Language Dynamics group. If you have any other questions, go ahead and email us at trainings, that's plural, training with an S, trainings at language dynamics with an S group.com. So all one word, languagedynamicsgroup.com. So trainings at languagedynamicsgroup.com. I think I hit it. Go ahead and send us an email. We will get to you. So if we don't know how to answer your question, we will get an answer from Trina or whomever is the most appropriate, kind of whoever has the expertise that we do not have. So without further ado, thank you so, so much, Dr. Spencer. Really appreciate your time, and it's really exciting to see this out there. And yeah, thanks for your work and actively caring about this population of learners.
Thank you. I do have to say that if it wasn't for those SLPs who were trying to adapt story champs to begin with, I probably would not have had the knowledge or motivation to develop the AAC version. And I really, really love when we partner with community based, partners to inform what we should be doing. That is how we develop products. So if you guys have, you know, suggestions or are trying some things out, please talk to us. Like tell me what you want to see and what you need in your sites. Okay.
Yes, we are always accepting also if you're like, hey, I really want to know how to do research or I have a research question, you email us at that trainings@languagedynamicscareer.com because we absolutely love helping you. And also it's great when we form a partnership that benefits so many more people. So,
Yeah. Thanks,
all
Megan.
right. All right.
Thank you,
Thank you
everyone.
all so much. Have a great day. Have a good evening. Stay safe. Stay cool if you're in the US. And talk to you all. And we'll see you all again very soon. Thanks again.